Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. Today I was going to give you the transition pictures for Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist who was assassinated recently, September 2025. But his life, his work, and his death impacted so many millions of people globally that it seems insensitive to do it right now. The grieving goes on. So maybe next week I'll put it up, depending on how things are going. In the meantime, though, there was somebody else who's been asked for many, many times, and that is Henry VIII. I did pictures for Anne Boleyn, his second wife, and after that many people wrote and said, now please do the transition pictures for King Henry himself. And I simply never got around to it, but now I have, and those pictures are really interesting. So I'll tell you those. I also did our little time travel experiment, you know, the way we do, to go back to the 16th century, the time of Henry, and see how life was back then. Absolutely amazing. So I'll tell you those as well. But Henry died in the year 1547 at the age of 55. Nobody really knows what he died of, but it's thought to be heart failure in some form because he was so ill and so obese. He had a 54-inch waist at the time. This was a suit of armour that he had made for him. That's how large he was. He ascended to the throne at the age of 17, so he was king for 38 years or so. And as a young man was very lithe, very athletic. But as he got older, he got fatter, and in his final year, following a jousting accident that gave him a wound that festered a lot and was very, very painful, he got gout and had scurvy and all manner of other problems, and of course he was overweight as well, and finally his heart gave out. But I suppose he's most famous for having 6 wives. His first was Catherine of Aragon. While he was married to her, he had an affair with her lady-in-waiting, Mary Boleyn, and then fell in love with Mary Boleyn's sister, Anne Boleyn, and married her. And because he was king, he simply told the Catholic Church to annul the marriage to Catherine, and they refused. So, because he was king, he said, all right, in that case, if you won't annul my marriage, I will annul your church. And he separated the Catholic Church from the Church of England, shunned papal supremacy, and made himself head of the church. He dissolved the monasteries, he dissolved the convents, and he ushered in the Protestant Reformation. He married 4 more times after that because he wanted a male heir. He had many children over the years, but there were miscarriages and some were stillborn. And I think 1 male survived, King Edward VI, but not for that long. And Henry was left with 2 very significant daughters, Queen Elizabeth I, whose transition pictures are on this channel as well, and also Queen Mary I. In his younger days, Henry was smart and charismatic. I mentioned athletic, but he was also a composer and a writer. As he grew older, though, and sicker, and as the wound from his jousting accident took hold and started to fester, he became paranoid and more tyrannical than ever and impossible to deal with because they didn't have the medicine or the way of dealing with pain that we have now. Before I get to his transition pictures, though, I would like to tell you what happened when I did that time travel thing back to the 16th century, which was the age of Henry VIII. Now, when I do these things, I'm always hoping that I'm going to be a witness to something important or be in the vicinity of the person I'm talking about. But I never am for some reason. It could be that I'm not targeting this correctly, or I'm just not allowed to see what I want to see. And so I simply have to open my mind and see what comes and take it from there. And these pictures were very, very interesting, but Henry VIII wasn't in them. And that was disappointing. When I went into the energy for this time travel thing, I saw a turret, a stone turret, like a watchtower, I thought. And I was inside the turret. There was a balcony halfway up, and I stood on the balcony occasionally and looked out across the countryside, surveying the horizon. either fearful that somebody was coming, or maybe this was my job, to man this turret and look out. But I seemed nervous. Like, what happens if somebody does come? What am I going to do? And eventually, people did come. I looked down the stairwell, and there were men at the bottom of the turret. They'd come in, and they were looking for something, possibly for me, I thought at the time. But they were looking for something, and they were discussing something. I could hear their voices echoing up the stairwell. And one of them, I seem to remember climbing up the stairs a little bit, and then the other two said, just let's go. And they left, because I was sitting there, and my heart was racing that they were going to come up and find me. Maybe I was trespassing or something. But anyway, they left. But I realized that I couldn't leave now, because they might come back, or they might just be over there, and they might see me leave. So I hunkered down in this tower and stayed till nightfall. And looked out, and there was nobody there, I thought. I didn't see any fires or lights or anything. So I went down to the ground floor and out into the night. There was a stream in a little valley, like a cleft, with lots of rocks in it, stones and rocks, and the water was trickling around these rocks. And I followed the river up. It was very hard work. So clearly I was hiding from somebody. I was worried about something, worried about being seen or found. And so I carried on walking, then eventually left the stream and climbed up the bank of the stream through the bushes and stuff, over the hill, and there was a little house nestling down below. This, I assume, was my home. By the time I got inside, the sun was coming up. And that's when I heard horses. I heard people coming on horseback. There were 3 men again. I don't know if it's the same men or different men, but there were 3 men arrived. This terrified me. So clearly I was being hunted, or I was needed for something, and they were coming to get me, whatever it was. But there was genuine fear here now, because I was in my little house and they were outside and they were heading for the door. So I ran out of the back door as they were entering the front door, and I hid in a sort of trench. It was dug into the hillside, a kind of boxy trench. And I crouched down and hid, because maybe from the house you couldn't see that there was a trench in it or something. I just stayed there, I crouched down, and I waited. And eventually they left. The horses left. You could hear their hooves on the road. And at that point I went back into the house in a panic, got some kind of burlap blanket thing, and began putting things in it. I was going to be leaving really, really soon. I just gathered stuff up into a little bag that was very, very sparsely furnished. There was almost nothing here. But what I did have and what I needed for the journey, I stuck in this blanket and I went. And I think after that, I simply moved to a different area entirely and escaped. It's such an abstract piece of life, really. And I don't have a full explanation for why I was so terrified and why I was on the run or hiding so much. But clearly I was wanted for something. Clearly I was being called upon to submit, to surrender to these men, whoever they were. And although it's inconclusive, I did find it very, very interesting. The lack of facilities that we are so used to now. The lack of ambient noise, the fact that people were travelling on horses, and so on. So now, in that kind of setting, I did the transition pictures for Henry VIII. Bear in mind that in the final year of his life, he was very ill and in great pain, and clearly the end was nigh. But when I went into his energy, he was standing on a surface, facing this way, facing life, I suppose, facing his history. But at some point, the situation, his ailments, the pain even, must have become too much for him, because he spun around and yielded to the prospect of death. I think he was very controlling in his life, because he was king for all those years and had a sense of entitlement. But even somebody of his strength and determination had to admit at some point that it was over, and that he was not coming back from this moment. And at that point he went, okay, goodbye. And he fell off this high place that I saw, and there were clouds below, and maybe he was expecting some kind of soft landing. In actual fact, underneath the clouds there was a hard surface. He must have had a heart attack, or some really painful last-minute episode that saw him out. I remember when my father died, I did his transition pictures, and there was a similar thing. He fell, hit an object or a rock or something, and went down, metaphorically speaking. And there must have been some last-minute pain, and then he was gone. Same with Henry VIII. He hit a surface rather than floating down, which is possibly what he imagined. But it was sudden, and at that point he was in the tunnel leading to that cave that I always see. It's symbolic, it doesn't exist, and yet it helps me frame how they're feeling and what they're going through as their consciousness dwindles away. There was a sense immediately of freedom from his ailments. He realized that we are not our body. When we die, we leave our body behind, together with all its problems and attachments, and so on. And now he was free and let off the hook, basically, from all those illnesses that had plagued him for the past few years. Even though he was head of the Church of England, I'm not too sure he was that religious or even spiritual, really, more superstitious. He thought, well, I'm king, so this is going to be easy. And then he found himself in this place, in his consciousness, that said, no, there's nothing special about this. You've left the world of form behind, and now you're in the world of formlessness. The game is different here. The parameters are different here. That little tunnel I always see must be representative of a portal, taking us from full ego awareness to spiritual awareness. This is where we learn that we are not our body, and we never were. There is a lightness of being here because we've left behind our humanness and we're fully in our beingness. For somebody like Henry VIII, it must have been a revelation and felt very sobering to me. Like, I know I was king there, with all the privileges and responsibilities and complications of running a country, but now all of that has gone. My illnesses have gone. My power has gone, but there is a relief in this. That's what I felt. The relief he was experiencing. But here's what's really interesting about him that is unlike most of the people that I have done. There was no let-up in the way he approached the process of dying. I assume that in life he was immensely active and busy, because when he got to that little symbolic cave I always see, there was no rest for him. He started walking around, obviously metaphorically, walking around and inspecting it. Now, what's next? He kind of cracked his knuckles like, what's next? What do we do now? What's on the agenda? He saw the tunnel on one side. It's a symbolic tunnel that people go up to reach the point of ascension. He saw that and said, I'll get to that in a second. For now, I just want to inspect this area. What are we going to do? It's like he'd never been bored in his entire life and feared boredom. He feared simply relaxing and being on his own not having people around or duties to perform. And he was actively searching for responsibilities, I thought. He was a very restless spirit. But there is nothing to do but surrender. So he walked up the tunnel, which was quite a steep climb in this one, but it felt conditional the whole way, like, well, okay, I'll do this, we'll look around, but then we'll come back and we'll figure out what we're going to do down there. He was so self-determining in life and so willful, so bullheaded, that there was no issue of giving in to what the universe wanted of him. This is what he was going to do. So off he went, and normally that simply ends up at another little cave with a dome of light in it, which is representative of that moment where you finally transition. Only in his case, the entry point to that cave was high up on the wall. And he looked down on this metaphorical dome of light and couldn't reach it. He didn't know what this was, or where he was, or why matters had been taken out of his hands at this point. He was very willful. But down below, I could see another tunnel entrance. That was the way in, and he had to reach it somehow. There was, to his left, a dark passageway, and he was forced to go down there, and that led to that entrance. But when I followed it down, yes, that was the final stage of dying, but it wasn't the end of this little passageway. It carried on up the other side. So I followed it up, and there was a space at the top of it that had a number of, well, they weren't domes, like smudged lights in it, in the shape of domes, but small ones. He tried to touch one, but his hand went straight through it. They were illusory, like the Hall of Mirrors at a carnival. None of it was real. But it was asking him, I felt. At first I thought it was about repentance. Some form of atonement for what he'd done in life. But I think, given my experience with these transitions so far, it had more to do with surrender again. Releasing his attachment to what should be. Forcing him to let go. To dismantle his willpower as a former king and become one with the process. Because the ego energy, control energy, is a low vibration energy. Ascension requires a high vibration energy. So the more you can let go of the low vibration stuff, the easier you become to lift. So maybe the repentance was repenting for what he'd hung on to that was unnecessary or was very earthly and human and royal and which didn't matter at all. And he was being asked in this room of smudged lights to appreciate what this process was, and that his days as a ruler, a monarch, were over now. Now he was in spirit, and spirit is a high frequency, the highest frequency, vibration. And all he had to do was stop fighting. Stop imposing his desires and his will on the circumstance he found himself in. He went back down the passageway to stand in that entrance before the dome. And it was like, oh, so I'm really just a person. All of that pomp and ceremony and all the titles and the money and the properties, the castles, They really don't matter, right? All I got to do is let go of that and align with the light that I am seeing in front of me. But to the bitter end, presumably because he was a king for so long and royal for his entire life, to the bitter end, he couldn't shake off those last vestiges of self-importance, of grandiose entitlement, I didn't think. Because as he stepped forward towards the light, as crushed as he was in so many ways, there was still a sense of, okay, you know best. That's what you want. Take me. Of self-sacrifice, actually. It wasn't just a voluntary stepping into the light and he's gone. This was more of a, okay then, in this situation you win. And then he stepped into the light, closed it behind him as if it was a curtain in a department store changing room, which several people do in these pictures, actually. He shut it behind him and went. He didn't want the world to see, of course the world wasn't looking at all, but he didn't want the world to see a monarch in this state of submission and what he felt was defeat. That's what it felt like. It's like, okay then, you win. And he went in, closed the curtains behind him, and then he was gone. I think we're being invited to learn the difference between what matters and what doesn't. And maybe as the years go by, this will become more evident. Yes, he had castles and a church and all sorts of different things, but none of it mattered. In human history, it matters, but in eternity, it's insignificant. And I do wonder how much time in our mortal stay on this planet we dedicate to things that are insignificant, that don't matter, to worries that never come to fruition, to fears that never materialize as events, to acquisitions and to status and whatever else. I think the more we can learn that we are transient beings on the side of form, but eternal on the side of the formless, and embrace more of the formlessness that we have inside, that eternal divine spirit that we have inside, the more we can do that in our beingness and live there, in that sanctuary where we are safe and protected and guarded and guided, the more we can do that, the more we get a sense of perspective on what doesn't matter. And our attachments to those things that don't matter can be loosened or released. And they will trouble us less because we are safe within our sanctuary of spirit, of divinity that we have inside. I'm not absolutely sure Henry VIII learnt that lesson fully by the end, but that's what Grace seemed to be trying to tell him. And all that happened really was that it crushed his ego and, maybe severed a few of those attachments. But at a spiritual level, he didn't seem to be able to fully give in to the process. He did enough to transition, to be lifted. But there was some work to be done there, and I wonder how that will be done on the other side. That's not my remit. I don't know what happens then, but it does seem that he had work to do. And Grace, as I said, was very patient and is very patient. And in the end, everything works out just fine. That's what I learned from King Henry VIII. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.